last session of the day. This is the methodology and practice session. Why am I doing that without my glasses? Just to remind ourselves of the questions that were put in the original call for papers. How can we demonstrate rigor in practice research? What are your methods and documentation and analysis for researching aesthetics and process through your practice? We have the three papers that we've all been watching from Andy Visser, James, am I going to say this right? Redelinghuys? Heiss. Redelinghuys, and Scott McLaughlin. So we're going to do the same thing that we've been doing all day and have 5 minutes from each person, and then I shall start throwing some questions around and we'll have questions from you lot as well. Andy, do you want to kick off?
Is this working? Yeah. My name's Andy Visser, and I'm a PhD student at UWL, but I'm also a lecturer at UWL. And my sphere of research is based around haptics or touch. So I'm working in virtual reality at the moment in a thing called Unreal Engine, which you may or may not have heard of. It's just a virtual reality program. And I guess the gist of my research has been around whether haptics is actually useful or not. So I've been designing some skeuomorphic interfaces inside of Unreal Engine, which I'm testing with various audio and music production systems. And the kind of crucial research question here is there a benefit or not to haptically enhancing this particular interface that I've built? So that's the background of it. And I think the next thing I want to talk about really is the fact that I have been searching for a methodology that would be useful to me in my research. Obviously, as a PhD student, I have to identify a methodology and associate myself with it. And in my sort of search for that, I've come to the conclusion I couldn't quite find a methodology that really worked for me. So in order to sort of talk about that, I need to go back a bit to who I am and my background. So I trained as a classical musician quite young. I think I've been playing since I was about 5, and did various things classically, and then retrained for some reason to work as an electronics engineer in a car company for 10 years. I sort of thought that was an aberration at the time, and looking back on it, I think it was quite useful because I learned some sort of sciencey engineering skills that I've been applying ever since. And then I realized what I really wanted to do was to be the musician that I'd started out to be at the beginning. So at the age of, I think, 29, I went back and did a degree and a master's, ended up at the Royal College of Music doing some weird electroacoustic compositional work, and began to get into what I'd call my kind of musical journey. I've split my time between all sorts of different music. We were talking in one of the other sessions earlier about whether we were practitioners or academics. I think I'm a bit of both. But that's also the issue because coming back to methodology, what methodology do I use to do my research? Do I stick with a kind of science methodology where everything's numbers and data, or do I go to the other side and go to a more qualitative, reflexive methodology? And I think, as I said in my video, the next thing I did was realize that this methodology is quite badly classified in the literature. And it's very often confused with method. I think we all think we know what methods are, we all think we know what methodology is, but it's amazing how many times people put methodology on the title and talk about methods or vice versa in a paper. So that was my first issue. There's some confusion over the terminology. What is a mixed methods research? Is there a mixed methodology? Because I think what I determined was that I needed some kind of mixed methodology. Braun and Clark, usual thing. They talk about this package of theory and design and methods. So whilst I'm interested in mixed methods, that in itself wasn't enough. I couldn't have picked, or at least I felt I couldn't pick a methodology that was a science-based or a non-science-based methodology because those methodologies didn't really deal very well with method. So I've proposed a novel methodology, mixed methodology, which is really very contextually aligned to what I'm trying to do. I wouldn't say it would work for anyone else necessarily, but it's where I've ended up in my view of where I need to do my research. And so within that mixed methodology, I'm interested in this process of using mixed methods, but perhaps in a slightly different way than I see a lot of people in, let's say, science-based methodologies, where they'll do some quantitative work, they'll do some qualitative work, but they won't let the two get anywhere near each other. They don't want to really integrate their findings or their processes. And my model proposes a series of parallel events rather than serial events around experiment and exploration. And if you've managed to get to the end of that 20 minutes, and well done if you did, you'll see that I've proposed a model that isn't a serial model, it's a parallel model. And I've got to the point in my PhD where I've actually undertaken and completed an experiment now. I have some nice data, but I really want to do some non-sciencey things with it. So I'm interested in this idea of applying qualitative processes to quantitative data or quantitative processes to qualitative data. An example of that is I'm just doing some sentiment analysis on the semi-structured interview data that I got from this first experiment. So out of the qualitative statements, and with the help of the latest AI, GPT, et cetera, I'm getting some very nice numbers, some quantitative numbers out of qualitative data. That's only 3.5 minutes. Shall I shut up?
Up to you.
Okay. Have I got anything else to say? So I think this really is for me a quest to try and identify a mixed methodology. Of course, I'm only halfway through this PhD, so I'll report back later whether it worked or not. But I'm in the process of trying to undertake this as a process. And wherever I can, to remind myself, if I happen to be in a sciencey mood, that I need to think qualitatively and reflexively about that. And I will also remind myself when I'm thinking aesthetically or artistically about what I'm doing, that maybe I need some numbers too. Andrew, you pointed out earlier today this idea that if you're in a science-based framework or methodology, if it's not got numbers attached to it, it doesn't count as real research. And I'm interested in that, and I'm also slightly trying to counter all that. And there must be a middle way. And I haven't really seen much written evidence of that. There is a little bit. I've mentioned a couple of papers where I do see some actual mixed methodology frameworks existing, but they're few and far between. So I think that's what I'm trying to say. And if anyone wants to talk to me later about the actual nature of the haptic research, I'm happy to do that. But that's not really the centre of what I'm interested in here. What I'm interested in now is my attitude to the process of identifying and perhaps inventing and augmenting a mixed methodology so that I can apply it. Yep, that's enough.
Great. Thank you. Okay, no, I'm not going to talk yet. James, you have...
Hi all. So I'm writing what I termed methodology, contra-methodology, playing on sort of counterpoint, punctum, contrapunctum, methodology that is above, below, inside, outside, before, after, with, against methodology. That methodology is at once an infinite coiling together in the present and the present infinitely exploding outwards. And I don't know how many of you have watched my video. I haven't really watched it since putting it up. So in the absence of a desire to clarify or reiterate anything there, hopefully I'll be able to shade it a bit differently here. And as someone who very much believes in Alain Sixou's call to write yourself, your body must be heard, perhaps I'll offer some information about my being so that hopefully the body that sits here and wrote and spoke and edited that video can become audible. I'm someone who, in my being, cannot so easily separate out practice and research. For me, this field from which I emerged to make practice, the practice itself, this curious turning over that might be called reflection, all seem to me in this sort of quantum simultaneity. And anything, thinking, writing, designing, performing music, along with writing prose and occasionally some verse, all seem to me to be part of the self-same jouissant excitation of my being, in sort of the same mode as a classical oracle or the holy fool or even a psychotic. My interests are primarily to do with the body and what I term flesh, drawing primarily on the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and, as I said, Alain Sexou. But it's to the former that I'm thinking about this, and his encounters with Saussurean semiology, and he came to understand art. He was thinking about painting at the time as these coiling together, or these spirals of style, and that style cannot be understood positively. And I think this is self-evident in a way. If style were positive, there's no way we could point to Beethoven as different from Mozart, or if we appeal to style as something natural, then that would mean all style and all art was exactly the same across time and space and culture, and it's not. And my worry with taking up a position that can be separate from style, outside of these coiling togethers, and look at it, is my fear is that this becomes a fragmentation of being in the world. And it insists both too much on a linear continuity and too much on a separability, that it can be something aesthetic over there. And in this kind of weird too much fragmentation and too much continuity, my fear with this is that it becomes easily co-opted by capitalism, that capitalism, the being alienated from labor, is this breaking apart of our being in the world and our contact with the world. What's also important to me is that this isn't an intellectualist linguistic exercise, but it's drawn from my experience of making music, that music is never a thing over there to be manipulated or observed, but it's something that, as a performer, one feels it welling up from inside you to spontaneously burst forth. As a listener or a performer, music is curiously flowing through the air in all directions, always moving away, always in contact with skin, queering really interiority and exteriority in this way.
Thank you. Again, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to say Scott.
You're saving these up. Hi, I'm Scott McLaughlin from the University of Leeds. I'm throwing down a proposal here, I think, which I'm interested in. I don't know if I entirely believe what I'm saying. Pretty sure I do. I think it may be a hill I might die on, but I'm very happy for someone to come up and give me a rope down off the hill. At least we'll see how it goes. But my argument would be that central to research within the UK, research with a capital R, research that sits inside institutions, etc., there are various definitions of research. The institutions we work or study in are very, very concerned about what is and isn't research, and there are some hard lines that are drawn. So a lot of my argument here is pragmatic. This is, I should say as well, I'm also, I run the Royal Musical Association's Practice Research Study Group and Leeds' Practice Research thing. So I'm very interested in finding ways of supporting people and helping people understand, because it is a relatively young methodology that we all work in. The point is, with rigor is something that comes up all the time in definitions of research. In some ways, the highest definition of research we have in this country is the definition from the Research Excellence Framework, which, while not everything is about ref, it does sit right in the corner of things and exerts an influence everywhere. So the point is, no matter what we do that is called research, somewhere along the way, someone is going to say, but is it rigorous? Because that is one of the three things it has to be. It's literally one of the characteristics our research is judged by. Is it rigorous? And of course, a lot of this comes from old STEM and humanities ways of epistemologizing this. Rigor in the STEM, as we know, is relatively straightforward to be able to talk about because it's a quantified area. We know what rigor looks like there, and when you slip into the social sciences where it swaps between quantitative and qualitative, rigor is still important, but it gets defined in slightly different ways. I think for us in the practice research area, rigor is a very tricky thing to try and define because we don't have numbers to fall back on. We don't have a lot of methods that are shared from place to place that you can say, well, you've not done the method rigorously, therefore your research is not good, or vice versa. So we don't have a lot of models, we don't have a lot of things to base our decisions on. When someone says, is your research rigorous, it's hard for us to say, maybe. Who knows? So my proposal would be that because we don't have those kind of hard methods to base our assessment of whether we're being rigorous or not on as a community or as a set of overlapping disciplinary communities, my argument is that, and this comes from many years of looking at PhDs and other things and trying to see the places where things need to be shored up to make them useful research, is around the area of demonstrating a context. Where is this research coming from? Who is it useful to? It's the biggest thing that I see in PhD vivas, reading someone's 10, 20, 30, 40,000 words and all of this music they've made or played or something. And it comes down to the end and it's all very beautiful. And I'm like, but who's it for? Who is going to pick up this and read it and go, oh, that's just what I needed. How do I get it out there? And when they read it, how do they know it's rigorous? And for me, the thing that makes that rigorous is that you can see the pathways that they come from. You can see all the other people who've done stuff like this, all the other people who've done relatively similar research, and you can say, right, I've scoured the research community, and no one else is doing the same thing I'm doing, so here's my contribution. Here's the little extra stone I put onto the hill of things. And that the other side of my argument would be that the other place we can be rigorous is how we communicate it. If I write a string quartet that does something really awesome and is something no one else has done, and I can say this is a true contribution to knowledge, it's doing something different, and it's useful to other people, I can put the recording out there, but maybe you can't actually hear what it is about it that's novel. Maybe it's hidden away in the notation, maybe it's somewhere in a technique that you can hear the result of, but you don't know how it's being done. I can put the score out. Maybe the score makes it a bit clearer, but I think the rigor goes to the point of how have I communicated it to someone else? How have I found who are the people for whom this is going to be useful, and how have I got it out for them? Is there 5 different versions of this I need to put out in the world to make it useful for string players, for composers, for pedagogues, for people who are researching the history of string instruments? I don't know. So that's my fundamental argument, I think, that the 2 things that we can use as proxies for rigor are, have I scoured the field? Have I got a clear context for this that shows where it's coming from? And then have I communicated in a way that is effective? Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. So I wrote down 5 things when I was I'm not going to just reel them off and see where we go. I'll just try one at a time, and they're not necessarily in the order that they might have emerged, and some of them might have emerged from things that you put in your presentation more than the things that you've reiterated now. And the first one of them is, I've got quite strong thoughts about the distinction between the subjective and the objective, and that, I mean, in general, these are sort of socially constructed terms rather than literal terms, if we like. I mean, everything's a socially constructed term in some way or other, but that very often, particularly in practice research, the kind of eye of subjectivity is talked about as being autonomous, and the objectivity is often described in terms of, is it measurable? And for me, measurement is one of the primary subjective things in the world. Measurement doesn't happen anywhere but in our heads. We're the, pretty much the only animal that measures things. So and obviously measurements are subjective approximations in some way. Their usefulness is the sort of the aspect of it. And so there were several moments in all three of your presentations, and to some extent just now, that made me think about what it is, how useful those terms are, and what do they mean to us, and what effect it has on our thinking to use that as a dichotomy, which we tend to do all the time. Well, why don't I leave it there and sort of throw it? Who wants it? James, you're sort of chomping at
Yeah. Sort of before get onto subject-object, measurement doesn't just exist in our head. It's very real. We know this from quantum mechanics. We know that to measure is already to be within an assemblage and affect the world. This is sort of just the most written about example, but this is the effects of colonialism, that in a way it is to know the other, and in some way it often violently changes that. And with subject-object, I'm wondering if there's a need to, do we want to negotiate through these terms? What's the value in keeping them in the first place? I mean, to what extent are we reinforcing Cartesianism by even arguing against this Cartesian? Again, I turn to the sciences for this, that both contemporary physics and contemporary life science are making incredibly strong anti-Cartesian points in their work. And I'm thinking, of course, about Karen Barad and Donna Haraway, but there are lots of others who are working with this. So my wonder is whether, to what extent does this even need to be a conversation at some point? Or can we attack it at the metaphysical level rather than trying to work through it?
Okay. Should I respond, or do you want to?
You respond to that, and then I'll respond to you. Yeah. Because I was going to give you back an answer, but you finish that.
I can't finish that.
Okay. Well, I'll jump in, because I was just talking about this. I'm still not quite clear what you meant about subjective versus objective in terms of measurement.
I mean, my definitions of subjectivity and objectivity are that subjectivity is that which exists within the mind, and objectivity is that which exists outside of the mind. Yep. And well, that's...
So if I was applying those phrases to my pragmatic example of the actual research I'm doing at the moment, there's obviously, I think it's a sliding scale to some extent between the subjective and the objective, but in order to get, on a basic level, the things I'm doing to actually work, I need to use what I would call objective numbers, because if I used a subjective view on that, nothing would work. I suppose that's the first point.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is the problem with having this discussion every time, is that the immediate thing that came from all the sort of postmodernism things is, well, if you take that to its logical extreme, it means this. And for me, it doesn't mean that. It's just, there isn't a logical extreme. There is...
I agree with you in the sense that the fact that I call that measurement, that particular measurement, is a subjective thing. but there is a sort of set of numbers that I have to deal with in order to progress, I think.
Yeah, no, and I think, Scott, you come in. Well, what I was going to say is that for me, objectivity is useful to the extent that it's about representing things.
Yeah.
That we can work on the basis as if this is true. We can also recognise that there are, problems of knowability, but also problems of measurability in everything, and that they are sort of approximations. But that doesn't make them not useful. And surely, the sort of pragmatist approach is it useful to think of it as if this was true? And that, I think, has been, it's the basis of the way that science has progressed for hundreds of years, is that it's been useful up until this point to think of it in this way and to extend that theory a little bit further. And then suddenly we go, oh, actually, that doesn't work anymore.
No,
Let's
I
go
agree with
backwards
that.
a bit
Yeah.
and go start a different as if and move off in that direction. And so it's a way for us of making sense of the world. I'm not suggesting that the outside world doesn't exist in any way, or that
Or maybe it doesn't.
or maybe it doesn't. We're maybe in the Matrix. Who knows? But that the as-ifs of representational systems. So I'm talking a lot more than I thought. I'll get to you in a second, Scott. The as-ifs of representational systems within practice research, for me, are working out gradations of rigor to the extent of how much am I going to require myself to go further than potentially I need to. And in, I think a lot of us in practice research, where we come up against this sort of objection in particularly academia, where the sort of scientific methods of the social sciences have held sway in research departments, and we come up against this resistance of that, well, that's not objective, or that's too subjective to be considered rigorous. And I mean, well, okay.
Yeah, but I think I agree with you. In principle, I agree with you, but I think that's also why I'm still searching for a better methodology than the science methodology, or the opposite somewhere. I think I'm trying to find a hybrid where I'm able to, at the same point, hold subjective and objective opinions about a particular thing.
Yeah, and that was what I found really interesting about the paper, was that's.
Yeah.
It's not that I was violently disagreeing.
No.
It was that I was interested in what it meant for methodologies. Scott, do you want to?
I think there's a bit of a danger in practice that we reinvent the wheel on method and methodology a little bit. Part of the danger is because pretty much all of us here are probably in music departments, mostly, or close to. I think the question of pop music and music technology is especially interesting here, but I'll come back to that in a second. But we work in essentially humanities departments that have been dealing with interpretation and text most of the time. Musicology, apart from newer computational, etc. versions, musicology is largely a hermeneutic discipline. It's about interpretation of text. Whereas with practice, when we come in, I think the early days of practice, a lot of the problem was you had people who are essentially, in a weird way, but I think we're better aligned with the sciences than we are with the humanities and with musicology, in that we do stuff, we test stuff, we experiment, we mess around. Hans-Jörg Reinberger has a load of really beautiful writings about exactly this connection between the practices of the arts and the practices of science, and you can go into Latour and all of that, etc. But I think the danger is, though, that because we sit in such weird little worlds where we're out on our own and there isn't that many models for us to go on, that when we start talking about, and I may be slightly short-circuiting the conversation here a little bit, but that when we talk about objective and subjective and quantitative and qualitative, that there's this huge universe of social sciences that have been arguing this stuff for ages. And if we just go over and step in and look at their conversation and try and see where they've got to, that should hand us the tools on a plate to be able to say, right, well, what am I doing here? What have they done it? well, we don't have the training for that. We don't have what we need, if anything, is we need a kind of a short version social sciences who can come in and say, this is where we got to with the argument. Now let's cut and paste this onto where you are doing your music things, and let's see if that works. I think the problem, particularly in music tech areas, is because they're often housed in engineering departments or coming from engineering backgrounds. This means they're coming from STEM, objective measurement methodologies and biases, and that then gets tricky to escape from, and it gives you a kind of veneer of, well, I can still apply those methods because they look like they work in my area, but actually they may not work. So much qualitative and quantitative stuff is just about study size. Are there enough people in this study for the numbers to actually be meaningful? If I've only got 10 people in this, I might have numbers, but they might be meaningless numbers.
Yeah. It reminds me of the music technology session earlier on when Amandine was talking about collaborating with people who do know these things and working with ethnomusicologists or anthropologists, and Andrew was talking about actually a very similar thing that you're talking about to some extent, of trying to create musicological interpretations of quantitative data from very rigorous measurement to then talk about what it means from a musical interpretative perspective. So yeah, that is something that I think we should be doing is collaborating and cross-pollinating and not, as you say, trying to reinvent the wheel. Okay. Which leads me on neatly to something that I think was kind of central to some extent, to everybody's papers in some way, which is what types of new knowledge are we creating and how are they useful? And you were talking about, just a single stone of knowledge on top of the pile. I wonder what that looks like. What does it do? Because I think very often the way that practice research is kind of presented in a lot of ways feels quite technical in a musical version of the technical, when that, to me, and the other part of it is that if we are trying to be original in some way, then providing someone with a kind of technical solution to a problem or a way of fixing some or dealing with some aesthetic problem is not something that other people necessarily want to share. They want something behind that rather than the thing. They don't want to do what you've done, which in most other forms of research, the value of the knowledge is reproducibility and reusability. And that kind of aesthetic knowledge feels not pointless, but it's not got that same kind of uniqueness to it. It's whereas there's obviously types of knowledge that can lie behind that, and that's where I think your point about sort of exegesis and discussion makes sense. But I wonder if you've got thoughts about what kinds of mechanisms we could be looking for in that regard for new knowledge.
I'm going to retract my analogy for a second. To make it better, the stones on the cairn, we come and we drop our stone on the cairn of knowledge. Actually, I don't think it should be that. I think that's what it feels like, and I think that's part of the problem. What it should be like is we have an infinite pile of stones and we go and find the people to give them to who we think they're useful for. And it's not that we drop the cairn and other people come and find it. We should be going out there trying to get these to people. But this is in a roundabout way trying to answer your question in terms of it's just who is it useful for? Who are the people? If it's a technical description, then Because as you said earlier, this is socially constructed. Knowledge is socially constructed. Disciplines police knowledge that is socially constructed within those disciplines. Rigor is only meaningful within the social construction of knowledge made by a discipline. When disciplines cross over, then they have tensions and they work it out, probably. But that something like this, where you want to say, how do we get that knowledge out there? It's about packaging it up in a way that is meaningful in that discipline. And if you're trying to get something across to social scientists working with populations of millions and opinions, then you've got to wrap it up as stats. If you're not wrapping it up as stats, it doesn't mean anything. You're not speaking the language of that discipline. If you've got an ethnographic approach to something here, then it's got to be passed on in that knowledge form. I think it's whatever the discipline area that you're trying to reach, and there may be multiples. I think things have to be packaged up in a way that's meaningful to them, and then
Can I just
you're
jump in on
communicating.
that?
Please do.
Because I think
I also noticed that Ewan had a question over here, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's quite. I mean, this is not disrespectful. That's quite a bipolar view of it. It's either one or the other. And again, I still think there's somewhere in the middle for this, where you may have what I would call the numbers, but you've also got the aesthetic going in there. And again, I'm having to talk about my stuff because that's what I'm doing. But it's this idea that it isn't a numerical solution or an artistic solution. It's some hybrid, I think.
I think I'd go the other way, though, that it's the polarity is useful in the sense that you have a numeric solution or a number-based piece of knowledge that is useful for people for whom the numbers are useful, and you have an aesthetic one that's useful for aesthetic people, and for some people it might be both. I think I'm not trying to polarize, it's the other way around.
No,
I'm trying to say that they
Yeah.
go both ways.
I'm trying to jump them across. I'm trying to get people who would be looking at numbers to go, that's not a number solution, but I understand it, and vice versa. So it's that cross-pollination of those things.
Gotcha.
I think we agree.
Can I just ask you one thing before coming to James? Can you give me an example of something from your compositional practice research of the type of new knowledge that has come out of it?
Sure. So the project I did recently, which was on indeterminacy and writing for clarinets, it could be writing for any instruments, but it was focused on clarinets. Some of the new knowledge that came out of that was the knowledge itself was in terms of rethinking the paradigm for how we engage with instruments. So rather than starting with you play a C, rather than starting with that notational approach, it starts with the approach of you put your fingers in these holes in this place, and then we see what happens. That's a ridiculously oversimplistic way of looking at it. So that new knowledge was just an approach. Now, someone can take or leave that approach. They might find it a door that's opened up and they can go through that door. Then there's a bunch of, I think Mina's gone now, but Mina edited a wonderful book on new instrument thoughts, and I put a chapter into that which went into grim detail about treating clarinets from the perspective of starting with the physical material instrument and going from there. So, 20,000 words on what happens when you do this, what are the theoretical backdrops to this. So that's communicating maybe with a different audience. There's also a book of clarinet studies which has none of that stuff, and none of the theory, and none of the philosophy, and none of the materialism or any of that, but just says, look, if you start here and keep playing, watch what happens. And now if you start this thing and keep playing, watch what happens. So they're two totally different. I don't say for a second that I've cracked it, but I think that was a useful way to think of who is this useful for. It's useful for these clarinetists, and it's useful for these organologists thinking about instruments, and they need totally different approaches.
Yeah, I suppose. Sorry, no, James, do you want to?
Do you want to finish up?
No, it's okay.
I'm going to be accused of being a filthy postmodernist, but here goes. I think just drawing on both of your images of the cairn and the stone, for me, knowledge can't be understood as so particulate. I think in sort of the adoption of particular method, and I should clarify that I'm not against any particular method. I work mainly with poetics, but I'm certainly not against qualitative and quantitative methods. My contention is that neither of them has a privileged perspective on the world, and none of them reveal the world in any way. And there's a risk in bringing in ideas from the sciences and the social sciences that we carry with them the fallacies that are ingrained in our culture, in this post-Enlightenment culture, in liberalism and neoliberalism, that there is a thing out there called knowledge that we can come to understand. Whereas I'm perhaps being a bit Foucauldian here, but also going back to my phenomenology, that it's can be better understood as different ways of shading in the world, and that the category of new knowledge is nonsensical already in that way. And then I think on the concept of discipline, again, I'm not so ready to accept discipline, because it is, to be in a discipline is to be disciplined. It's for your body, your morphology to be disciplined in a certain way. And Leon brought up earlier today Halberstam Queer Art of Failure. And the first chapter of that is a pretty vicious attack on discipline in academia. So my fear is in saying that there is a particular knowledge to be produced or uncovered, we're also saying who this knowledge belongs to, what world this knowledge belongs to. And I look back at history and I see so many disciplines and the academy in general as launching, in the name of producing new knowledge, the destruction of women's knowledges, queer knowledges, disabled knowledges, indigenous knowledges, to provide a very abbreviated list. That's my fear going into this.
If I could respond briefly to that, only to say, of course, that the only way we can combat that, I think, is through the knowledge of what's happened in history. We learn from history. And yeah, the names are still the same. Disciplines still exist. Disciplines are a product of people. But that all of those forms of knowledge that's been out there, there's lots of approaches to bring those forms of knowledge back, or not even bring them back, but get rid of them. There's a more complicated way of saying that, but I don't have the word anymore. But allowing those back into spaces that previously had locked them out. But those also come from disciplines. Disciplines aren't everything. Disciplines are part of a story, but they're absolutely not everything.
And I think people who are working within disciplines are very often less constrained by them than the people who are trying to impose them from outside. Sorry, that's a very university management critique there.
But at the end of the day, we're all working within disciplines, whether we like it or not. They're gravitational forces around us. We can choose to push against them, we can choose to conjoin them or interact with them. We can choose all sorts of things like that, but ultimately they're still there and have a social power.
Yes. Yeah, I think the fuzziness of what's there is the thing that we could be playing with. I'll come to you in a second, Ewan. Just one final response to what you said about the example. And I thought the example was great because what it pointed to actually seemed to relate, I think, to sort of James's problem with the can metaphor, in that what it seemed, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but what I got from it when you said it was this is this knowledge is by making a process transparent through an example, and with practice research, the practical example is the vehicle rather than a written description of the practical example that is the vehicle for the, we can stay one step closer to the way that the knowledge can be accessed. It makes it a materiality, which it isn't, but again, it's another metaphor for how we learn. And therefore, that for me is that you can't very easily convey concepts like the one that you're talking about without examples, because its usability and its pragmatism isn't very understandable. And in fact, the knowledge is, look how I've done this. think about a way that you could use the ideas that inform that in a different way. And yeah, that's basically how I understood it. Does that? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Ewan.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Scott said about rigor being, on the one hand, about giving the research to the right people, which I think links to what James was saying, that if you have a preconceived idea of who will benefit from the research, then in a sense you're part of the problem of the research in that, it's kind of slightly elitist approach to doing research that we already know who's going to benefit from this, and it's people like me,
Maybe I did say the right people. This is not the way I intended it. I hope I didn't use that form of words.
Okay, I think I did pick that up from the video. The other thing was that to be rigorous, you have to know about precedents, and you have to understand where your precedents come from. And I understand that when we're talking to undergraduate students and we're saying, don't just do stuff. Think about who else might have done it as well and learn from it. Don't just invent this new bowing technique. There's an upside down bow on the string and then call it original. Because it's called legno. It's been around for hundreds of years.
It even has an Italian name.
Exactly. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think it's not possible to find examples of practice all the time. Upside down bow is easy, but there are some areas of practice where there's just you can't possibly find pre-existing examples of it, and I think that's where, again, if you can't be rigorous without somebody else already having done what you're about to do, then it seems like it's an impossible challenge.
Is this a lovely setup for me to talk about the Sparkle project, about a repository for practice research? I think first off, rigor's not binary. It's not, we could find nothing, we could find everything, this is rigorous, this isn't. I mean, sorry, I know you know this, I'm flipping the words back. But rigor's always going to be how far can you go with something? How far can you scrape? How far can you look? How tenuous a set of relationships can you construct to be able to say, well, we know what people have kind of done in this area, and I can show that what I'm doing is a little bit different or contributes something else. But you're completely right. It's so hard to find. I mean, even the people in this room here, a lot of whom I didn't know before today, a lot of people's research I didn't know today, PhDs get done, new knowledge gets formed, it sits in a repository somewhere, no one knows about it. I get a PhD application from someone wanting to do something, and I say, well, do you know about Bob's work? But how would they know about Bob? So that is something that people are trying to fix with a national repository for practice research, where it would all be in one place and be searchable and findable and keyword searchable, and that would be so much easier. But yeah, you're right. Without that, we are stuck.
But also, I think there's a danger there that we just have this circular information loop that is culturally exclusive, and also society, class exclusion.
Yep.
And I hate the global south thing, but it kind of excludes many people, what many people are doing in the world, and says this is what's important because it's on our repository, and everything else is kind of bleh, it's just stuff that happens without being rigorous. I thought another example would be something like Paul McCartney in the studio decides to put a massive piano chord at the beginning of a song. Where did you get that idea from? Who's done it before? Is that a rigorous
research process? But that's okay. Paul McCartney's not submitting to REF. I mean, if he is, he's probably all right. But have the University of Liverpool hired him yet?
Well, I think there's REF, but then REF. Anyway, we all know that. It's basically just a bean counting exercise to make the arts feel undervalued compared to sciences. Yeah, my name's Ewan, and I'm free for gigs all over the place.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think. I mean, there's so much in the politics that I've got my own personal bugbears. There are a million other bugbears. We've got 2 questions up there, 3 questions, so 4, 5, 6, 4, 5. Sorry, I can't remember your name. Jack? No.
One of you, I can't remember exactly who, used the dreaded M word earlier on of musicology, and I'm wondering, because I'm very interested. I really like this idea that practice research has suffered under its comparisons. It's been kind of stuck in this field, and particularly as I've gone to more and worked more in continental Europe, where they are slowly discovering artistic research, they are still mired in ontological debates about what it is. And that, I think, in large part is due to the very strict tradition of musicology they have there. And their definition of it in Musikwissenschaft, music science, it is very that's what they see it, and they describe it as scientific work. Do you see this? How do you view artistic research, or whatever practice research, in relation to musicology? Is there a relationship to be salvaged there, or should they be left alone?
Yes. There's definitely relationships. Of course, there's relationships to be salvaged, just like any other internecine. I can't pronounce that. Dispute. It's lack of familiarity on both sides, and one side judges the other by its own reflective whatsits. But totally. But I think as well there's historical schisms here that take a while to work out, and I think it just requires more people working with. Again, it's about opportunities, about where can you get people working together to do something useful, but it's also about there's so many times when skills are misread. When someone is brought into a project, for example, as just a tuba player, can you just come and play our nice tunes, please? I don't want your input. I don't want whatever knowledge and skills you have. I just want you to play as a tuba player. So I think particularly practice researchers, because we have this practitioner hat and this researcher hat, and probably a pedagogy hat, and possibly all sorts of other hats, it's easily reduced.
Sure, there has been a fundamental division that the artist is, almost like treated like an idiot savant sometimes. It's just the kind of person that has the talent, and the talent turns up and does the talent, and then they go home again. So
but the other side of it is that it in most of the artist research in continental institutions that I have seen, it's been very much about either historically informed classical research or contemporary classical, whatever you want. It's a very limited data set of types of practice that are considered the important types, which again goes back to this sort of huge political debate. And I think it's again to do with the wider politics of the way university cultures are working. The UK has this explosion of popular music courses, for good or ill, and that's it's happening in Europe, but not with research culture. It's happening in private institutions rather than So it's like the kind of BIM. What's Deutsche Pop called now? I've got another name anyway, but United Pop. Thank you, please. Yeah, so I think there's a sort of politics there. Were you waiting to... No. More questions? Have you got the microphone? Yes, great.
I'm just put in mind of a session at one of the RMA conferences a couple of years back, which Scott and I were involved in, where it was back when they were still doing hybrid Zoom rooms. So there were some people on Zoom and some people in the room, but the Zoom chat was open. And so you could see everyone sidebarring. And two of my colleagues at Goldsmiths, Pete Furness and the wonderful Simon McVeigh, for whom we all have a lot to owe to practice research, were sidebarring. And at one point, one or the other of them typed, multimodal artistic experiences require multimodal articulation. And everyone in the room went, oh, yeah, that's true. And there was a kind of like lull. And it's just, I was put in mind of that, Scott, when you were talking about these different ways of speaking to groups of people. And it seemed as though maybe, although we were talking about artistic outputs at the time, it seems to me that could also be something that could be said about articulating methodology. I wonder if you could just pick up on that a little bit.
In terms of methodology being transparent. No, that's not the right word.
Well, sure, but just the idea that you might describe an experience, which isn't just one thing; it's a lot of different things. But you might describe it using a specific kind of communication in a specific modality in a specific instance when you're describing it in a certain way. But actually, that there are many different conversations to be had about one thing, and perhaps this is actually it's not about breaking this down into streams of conversation, but about having more different kinds of conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that speaks a little bit to Ewan's question as well. It's not about aiming this in specific ways at specifically the right groups of specific people who stand to benefit and no one else should. That it's about putting it out in multimodal ways that are experienceable and understandable and resonate with more people. And I guess it's easier to think of people in groups of demographics because they're just easier to reach. It's less of a complex problem that way, but I'm right with you on video journals, poetics, put it all out there.
I'm utterly terrified by this reduction to demographics. I'm sorry, it's just this ice in my soul on hearing that. It's such for me, an horrendous way to control people. It's this widely used tool of capitalism to exert control. Is this segmentation into demographics for the purpose of delivering a product?
I'm right with you on smashing capitalism. Trust me, if we could start with that and build everything from that, I'm right there. Yeah, demographics, not a great word. I'm with you.
Agatha's had that for a while.
Is there a better word you'd use for divisions of groups of people?
I'm not sure.
Thank you. I might say a bunch of obvious stuff here, but nevertheless, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. My husband studied mathematics, and we often discuss the way the research is done in STEM disciplines versus humanities. And we suffer, or maybe we're privileged not to have this division between the applied and the pure, or the theoretical and the experimental in the humanities, in the arts. But does that mean that we should lack the clarity in setting our axioms when we do research? I feel that sometimes more clarity of thought and the kind of clarity of setting up your axiomatic place in the beginning of starting the research would be tremendously beneficial, especially when it comes to autoethnographic and practices research studies. It often feels to me, unfortunately, I have this sinking feeling, yet another paper about nothing. I don't understand where. It's a harsh way to put it, but often the lack of clarity of what is to be achieved and what is the purpose of maybe the self-exploration or the autoethnographic journey that the person writing a paper is pursuing is quite harmful to the discipline altogether, because we don't live in a place when solving something for a spherical cow in a vacuum has value. And maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. This is not me making a value judgment on it. I'm just talking about honesty and clarity at the setting off in a research to make it clear for what you're trying to achieve.
Can I just say something about clarity? And I know I'm going to frustrate this issue even further. I apologize. No, I don't. I'd always question the motive or desire to clarity. What is clear seems to me always hegemonic. And I'll give for myself to be a queer person, to be a neurodiverse person, is always to exist within our neoliberal capitalist society. It's always to exist in a state of unclarity. It is of no benefit to me to express myself clearly. It's quite a violence to me, actually. And I mean, I've talked to straight people before. I've even got a straight friend, so I can confidently speak about this. I have no desire for heterosexuality.
What about thinking about clarity in a way of honesty and understanding your intentions.
Sure, but to be honest about myself is always to continue in these cycles of obfuscation. That's my being.
But there is clarity behind what you just said, so there is honesty.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, let's go to Amandine. Down here at the front. At the front.
Yeah. So I will go back to some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning. I think at one point I got to read a book. It's called From Anxiety to Method in the Behavioral Sciences. I don't know if you know that. It's by Georges Devereux, 1967. So a French ethno-psychiatrist, so somebody who did study STEM and humanities. And I have given this book to a lot of my students, especially PhD, because it's kind of advanced, when they have anxiety around methodology, whatever the anxiety is coming from. And methodology and methods. But the book is particularly about method. And I think it has helped me so much. I read that very early on. I was not really a researcher at the time. But it has helped me so much. I was very anxious at the time. I'm well less now. But it helped me very much because it basically explained why, as a Westerner, regardless of gender, sexuality, even race, and level of ability, and all of those, as a Westerner, we are constructed in this way of thinking and analyzing. No matter what we think, no matter how much we hate it or we like it, doesn't matter. We just constructed this way. We went to school at a super early age. We were like taught in certain ways that makes our brain work this way. And the only way to get less anxious is basically finding a method to get up, to do things, to like make coffee, to do whatever. And when you go outside of your comfort zone for research, whatever the outside of the comfort zone is, you need method to be able to function, because otherwise you freak out. And this is like a Western thing. It's not something I've witnessed in West Africa, for example. Even in India, I remember some people making a lot of funny comments on the way Westerners are so childish, because they need all this kind of really analytic way of thinking, otherwise they're lost. And it's kind of true in a way. So I think it helped me to understand, okay, well, first of all, this method is just a tool. It's nothing else. It's never going to be more. So I say that today. It's like a studio tool. You want to do a project, choose the good one. It's going to help. You know, if you take one and you force yourself with it and it's the opposite of what you want, well, it's going to be tough. But it's nothing else. It's never going to be something more than what it is. It's a tool. And I think I forget sometimes. I forget because I'm like deep in a project. I work, so I collaborate with people who have certain type of expertise. I choose them very carefully so that they're open enough to understand where I'm coming from and where the people we work with are coming from. But we always take for granted that we won't understand fully what the others are. And we just want to find a way to communicate with them and do something with them that is deeper than what we would do if we don't have the right approach, I guess. And the right approach, there's a million of right approaches, but there's also a lot of wrong ones. So it's like trying to find the methods that basically help us to think differently and approach the way the others think or know or do things or create whatever with a bit more openness. And I think that's already very ambitious. And it's something I'm trying to remind myself all the time. Instead of like defending certain type of methods, you know, a certain type of thing. Then comes the methodology and the theoretical framework. And for me, the methodology is just the intersection between a theoretical framework and the methods. And more recently than reading this book, I found that the main problem in our field, maybe our fields, because we represent several fields here, is that we almost deny the fact that we're working out of a theoretical framework. So, you know, I keep telling people who do music psychology, because I teach them research, and I say, stop calling music something that is 3% of consumers in the UK and probably 0.000% in the world. So stop calling it music. Call it Western art, classical, or something like that. Define it. Stop calling it music, because it's, you know, it's really wrong. Like theoretically, it's really wrong. And just really constantly thinking, okay, what is the context of my research? How do I define it? I think it's helping to then design a methodology and then design the methods. I don't know if that makes sense, but the thing is, yeah, then it's hard to publish, very hard to publish this stuff. Not so hard to get grants, I found. Like, it's actually not it's hard to publish, and then yes, for the ref and all those things, and impact on all those whatever they are. And I'm not an expert, as I mentioned before. I'm not from the UK, and I don't understand the system. But I think, starting from questioning why we actually want method and why we do need method. And I think whoever we are in this room, we do need method because of the way we learn how to process things. And it's important to remember. Yeah, that's it.
Can you tell us the name of the book again, or the author?
Yeah, so the author is Georges Devereux, so George with an E at the end, Devereux, Devereux. The book is called From Anxiety to Method in the Behavioral Sciences, 1967. And there's a French film, don't remember who directed it, sorry, but it gives you an idea of who he is if you think the book is too big and you have tons of stuff to read. The film is like an hour and a half. And it gives you an idea. Long story short, he basically was hired in the States, so he's French, but in France, he didn't really make it until really late in his life. But he got hired by a psychiatrist hospital in a First Nation community, and they had a lot of people there who had some sort of symptoms and ways to deal with the symptoms that they could not relate to in the other hospitals. And the director of the hospital is open enough to think, this guy may have the solution. And the film is about this particular, I don't want to say project, but job that he had, where he basically cured a bunch of these people knowing nothing about their community, which is very interesting. So is the way he approached the work with these people who he didn't know, who he didn't take for granted that he would understand them or would basically be able to go, in a real communication with them, but he found a way to cure them. So it's kind of strong, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan, do you want to jump in? I mean, does anyone want to respond? No?
Always, I think probably a lot of us, latest obsession might be AI. And I think it's maybe prudent to always bring a thought of what AI might do to... We talk about these cans of knowledge, and we're dropping the stones or we're passing the stones on. However we're doing this, we've already generated a lot of institutional knowledge that comes with preset prejudices, more than any one of us can possibly consume, of the knowledge that already exists, some of it rigorous, some of it not rigorous, depending on whether you like to use the word. AI isn't going to discriminate on any of that. It's just going to absorb, generate information, push answers, and there will be an arms race. How does this affect our approach to methodology when universities begin absorption of knowledge at a rate we can't understand and generate answers we don't know how it got there? What does methodology mean when things are generating answers with methodologies we can't understand?
I think AI is a massive problem and needs to be stopped.
I think AI is a massive problem, but I'm using it already. And I think it's interesting because I think that there's a version of it that is going to be, it's already here and it's usable. And there's a version that's sinister. And I think there is going to need to be some, I don't know whether legislation is the right word here, but
are we just applying human terms to that?
Well, yeah, but what else have we got at this moment?
We have human terms.
Yeah.
My first degree in 1979 was in artificial intelligence, and it's been very interesting to see what has happened since then. I think, the thing that's very clear to me, that I've said to anyone who'll listen to me when I'm talking about it, is that artificial intelligence is good at learning, but it's not good at setting goals. And that is the ethical problem, I think, is that whoever gives it goals, almost certainly it's going to be the baddies, really. That's what happens in the world with most technologies. So I think the only thing that we could do, and this doesn't relate to music particularly, but I think the thing that we could do is think about how to address that problem. I don't know what the answer is, otherwise I could just click my fingers. Was there something?
Yeah, just on the topic of AI, because I think it goes back to my point on being as this such expansive participation in the world. And I confess to never having understood AI. So my understanding, a lot of it comes through the expansive work of the late great Hubert Dreyfus. And that AI represents the world. It doesn't, whereas our being, our in der Welt sein, is part of a transformation with the world. And that includes, or should include, an ethical accountability of the methodology we're using. And my fear is what I see in a lot of popular science on AI is researchers are seeing these very good facsimiles of human and then thinking and then assuming that the human operates that way. And this isn't a human exceptionalist point, but rather a concern that if we then accept the human as something algorithmic, as something deterministic that's following these set points, again, I see it as making ourselves vulnerable to a lot of coercive forces.
I agree, and I think that there's this sort of veil or fig leaf or something, whatever the metaphor is, of saying we're creating neural networks and therefore that is modeling human behavior. Those neural networks are one tiny part of the system, and the other things are all the control mechanisms that control them, and they're nothing to do with being modeled on human behavior. We're probably getting a bit away from the methodology question. Massimiliano, you got the magic wand.
Thank you. I apologize in advance for lowering the level of the conversation.
Lower than AI.
In such a dramatic way. But just one thing I haven't heard of and I'm curious about. And I wondered whether it can be methodologically permissible to do practical research from a historical perspective. For instance, for example, I am studying how in Renaissance courts, musicians imitated and absorbed the music and the dances performed by African freedmen and enslaved people, for instance, in the courts of Naples and Mantua. And often the sources are linguistic, like spotting a pigeon, or iconographic, so like spotting a dance pace in a painting. So how far can we expand the methodological boundaries of practical research? Because what we've been discussing so far is something that it's analyzed while things happen. But can we put this kind of research back in the past and in a historical context? Sorry about the question. I'm pretty destroyed.
No. What I love about that is it's a fantastic example of how the past cannot be understood as a fixed object, unchanging, that it's our material entanglements with the past that change it along with us. Again, this is a very quantum mechanical point. But it seems to me a very just the act of looking at this seems to be a creative act on par with composition, performance, anything being discussed today in a very comparable way.
Well, I was just going to say that the few examples that I've come across around this have been very illuminating, I think. I've got a PhD student, Anthony Magnell, who sort of remade some 1960s records, and he came across a load of kind of logical inconsistencies in the documentation just from the 1960s about, saying, well, this this is what everybody's been saying happened, but it can't have because I did it and it doesn't work. And I recently examined a PhD from someone who was trying to recreate Roman music from instruments and little bits of text and stuff. And very interestingly, things like the pictorial evidence, when you put the two instruments that were on the fragment of clay pottery together, one of them was 10 times louder than the other, and they couldn't possibly have made sense as a ensemble, as a duo. They were, one would have drowned the other one out completely. So it's just, again, some painter who just went, oh, I know these two instruments, I'll put them on the thing, And so there is a lot of interesting work that could be done. I mean, there's a load of stuff going on in the Orpheus Institute, if you look at the website, with the things like Beethoven's tent that goes over his piano and how must have that affected the way that he played and the way that he therefore wrote. And there are all sorts of interesting things like that give us hints rather than could be thought of as evidence or strong knowledge. And I think that, sorry, I'm going on. I think the point that makes is the kind of knowledge that Scott was talking about, which is that it doesn't necessarily tell us what happened, but it gives us some information about what couldn't have happened or what must have been an important factor that nobody had thought about before, and therefore it can kind of influence how other people might decide to do interesting reinterpretations of old pieces of music or whatever it might be. I think that kind of stuff from the archaeological reenactment methodology is a really interesting one. Not for me, but I don't mean it's not interesting for me. I mean, it's not for me as a process.
The only thing I'd tag on to that is that one of the advantages maybe of that research, again, like I was saying earlier about learning from other disciplines, is that not exclusively, but that's mostly historical research. You are learning about the past by trying it again in now. And so there are lots of paradigms from historians, from anthropologists of taking this kind of approach. I guess there is space for it being new in perhaps some of what you were suggesting about taking older things and doing them now and this giving us new things that don't shine any light on history entirely. But yeah, I guess it depends on again who you're trying to get this to. If the point of this is to make us understand the history better, or is the point of this to make new things, or is the point both? You mean the praxis in the past? Yeah.
Okay. I think we're probably going to have to... Oh, okay. One more question. You sure? You look so disappointed. When
I can ask afterwards if not. But I just wanted to ask quickly at the end about kind of more aesthetic and abstract forms of knowledge and how they fit into some of the frameworks thought about here. I really enjoyed your clarinet project, Scott, but the bit that will have the biggest impact on my work, on my PhD, is a bit that you didn't mention, which is the piece that you wrote. That wasn't in your list of kind of shared knowledge, but for me that is the most important part of knowledge in terms of just the impact it's had on my thinking. How exactly that's the case is quite hard to communicate because it's an abstract thing. One of the biggest influences on my PhD is probably the music of Linda Catlin Smith. That hasn't influenced me in a technical sense that I can nail down. I'm not using the same forms as her. I'm not using but there's a deep abstract connection that I feel to what she's written, and that I think doesn't quite fit into this qualitative and quantitative framework. Perhaps better fits with the things that James has talked about as kind of a poetics. And yeah, I wondered how that abstract type of knowledge that can be quite hard to nail down in these frameworks might fit in.
sorry, I'm not going to string this out too far, but when you say abstract, do you mean that as a proxy for kind of undefinable or unknowable to a certain extent?
Well, I don't think they're unknowable because I know it.
Yeah, you know it.
Exactly.
Incommunicable?
No, because I think I communicate it through my music. And that is a form of communication that then other people gain knowledge of those links. It's just that that communication might at no point end up being verbal or written, in written text.
I think there's always a limit to how much we can try and communicate. Yeah, my answer is terribly boringly pragmatic. It fits in there. I mean, poetics are qualitative. They are about qualia, or at least qualia is a way that you can think about the affect and etc. that comes out of poetics. Poetics also has other things, but it's not numbers, so it's not quantitative, and that then mostly falls into things that are about qualities. So I think from that perspective, again, there are people who talk about that. There are methods and approaches that can be taken to that, but I agree with you. There's only you can't get everything. You can't get everything out there, and you can't point everything out like a laser. You spew a lot of stuff out into the world and hope that this sloshes around and hits people for whom it's useful.
No, and I think sorry, I missed a little bit of the discussion, but I think that point of where's the sort of set of boundaries at either end of which we think this is good communication about whatever it is that we're talking about, might be, in some instances might be written, might be demonstrations of concepts through examples, it might be, but I also kind of have a problem with the idea that a piece in itself embodies the research unless there's exegesis of some point, of some sort, but that doesn't mean to say that I can't learn from it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel like it's been presented as research. It means that I've learned from it.
I just wanted to shout out, what about musicology? Like, what about studying it and extracting the juice and getting it that way? We don't have to do exegesis. We don't have to,
Well, I think that is sometimes the way to do it, but that for me is another form of exegesis.
Yeah, but analysis, sharing
Yeah.
knowledge through pulling music apart and understanding it, critiquing it,
Yeah.
engaging with it critically. We can in the 21st century, as part of 21st century music practices group, reclaim musicology as part of our discourse. We talk about each other's work.
Yeah, no, yes, and I think that again, it's about methodologies that are useful and are chosen for a particular project. That, sometimes historical reenactment, sometimes musicology, sometimes whatever. Right, we ought to call ourselves to a halt at that point. I did want to say 2 or 3 things to everybody, and I need to look at my notes. So I mentioned very briefly the idea of the Bloomsbury book series. I don't know how people feel about this, but any of the sessions today, to me, could be turned into one of these 4-author book projects, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's not that I can commission. I'm the series editor, but it's not that I can just commission things. We have to do a peer review process. But these 4-author books that I'd like to kick off, because it is a process that died a bit, are discussions rather than individual co-authored collections. So it's not like an edited collection. It is discussions where people write a bit, pass it on to other people, respond to the things that's been passed on to them, pass it around a bit more, and it happens 3 or 4 times and ends up as 80,000 words of discussion about a topic that uses loads of examples and so forth. It is also something that we can use musical examples in to connect to. So if anybody's interested in doing something like that as a discussion book, talk to me. That was one thing. The other thing, which I think I probably need to talk to Scott about, having heard about Sparkle for the first time, is that I've been talking to lots of people about the idea of a multimedia journal. And the reason I'm still talking about it is the ones that I've seen so far I find very unsatisfactory. And yet I don't quite know what the alternative is. But it feels like something that needs to happen, because not many of us feel that our research is best portrayed through the written article of 7,000 or 8,000 words. I don't know what that means, other than to just throw it out there to say, if people want to talk to me about that as well, I'd like to kind of maybe get a group of people who are interested in thinking about what is in essence quite the boring side of that, which is the logistics of it, how to make it work as a thing, rather than the exciting bit of I'll make you a video, or whatever that might be. But maybe I need to talk to you first, because it might be that Sparkle is going to be the thing. Okay,
but we definitely need more journals. We definitely need more multimedia journals, and I can throw you some. I know some people who've done ones in other disciplines.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've
as do you, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've come across yeah. Anyway, I think it needs a quite wide-ranging discussion about what it means. I think I've run down rabbit holes in the past where I thought, I'll set something up. Just because it's easier than talking to a lot of people, and it's always been screwed up. The other thing that I wanted to say is I've obviously got to email people about this, but today's sessions have been videoed, as you know. We are planning to put them on the website with the videos that you've created for the sessions. And then I'm planning to open up the comments section on the website so that there can be a further discussion from the quite a large number of people who've contacted me and said, I can't be there because I'm in a different country, or I can't be there because I've got to go somewhere else, or whatever. As I'm not sure if I've mentioned to some people, we've had about 700 people looking at the videos in the last week, which is obviously quite a lot. I mean, that's not 700 impressions. There's about 2,500 impressions and 700 individual people doing it. So it's got some, what's the word? Momentum. Legs. Traction, thank you. Legs, traction, all those metaphors. Again, if anybody is unhappy about whatever they've said today becoming part of the public record, can you let me know so that we can potentially do some editing?
It'll take a little while to get the videos ready anyway.
Yeah, but yeah, and also if anyone wants to run an event of some kind, I've already talked a little bit to Adrian. I'm going to put him on the spot by mentioning the fact that we've had a quick discussion, not about anything in particular, but if anyone wants to do something, I think there's a load of potential for these kind of flipped events. Another thing that I'd like to do is to do something where we kind of do some practice and open that up to interpretation from a whole bunch of different people. So I did a thing a while back called the Performance in the Studio, where we had 10 researchers watching 5 people make a record, and it was a nightmare. But it was in 2012. 2012 was it? Yeah. Oh God, I mean, editing video back then it was all done transferring cameras and 48-hour rendering processes. Anyway, but any interesting ideas for stuff like that? if anyone's not part of the 21st Century Music Practice Gistmail mailing list, you could join by going to the Gistmail website and saying, "Can I join the mailing list?" And I just click yes when it sends me an automated email. And that's probably it.
Can I make one very quick plug, just with my RMA Royal Musical Association hat on, with the practice research group, particularly people who are working in music tech and popular music, etc. We have a real dearth of people in that area. So if there's any resources that you think need to be out there, any discussions and study days and things we should be having around this, please get in touch. Otherwise, it'll just be me making stuff up.
And finally, thank yous. If I could just get you all to give a bit of a round of applause to our student team here who've been running the sound all day, relocating things. Thank you to Julia, Mike 2, Guy, Matt. You can figure out who Mike 2 is. Also, Simon, thank you for, and Veronica and Liz were up the back. We've been bashing our heads together for a while thinking, how can we come up with a format that's a little less dull than someone reading a piece of paper to us? And hopefully you've enjoyed, discussion, disagreement sometimes, which is amazing. I love seeing this, and I also love sort of the collegial way in which we all disagree so politely and Englishly. If you enjoyed yourself and you want to keep chatting to everyone, we're going to relocate to the pub, as is wont for English people. We're going to go to the new inn just because it's got lots of tables and less students. Sorry, guys.
Turn left, and it's about 200 yards on the other side of the road.
I'd also like to say a big thank you to the events team out here, those in the blue, give them a wave. And of course, Abby, who helped us set all of this up and made sure that we had sandwiches. And, all of those, lovely people guiding you around and doing all those sorts of things. So, but most of all, thank you. Thank you for bringing your ideas, taking the time to upload your ideas, which is, we did a thing that's quite honestly a bit of a pain in the ass. We said, can you do some labor for us first, then come and talk about it? And you did. And I think it's created something that is excellent. And for me, there are a few I haven't had a chance to look at now that I'm really keen to dive into. And it's all there. And I think that's really exciting.
I think that's the nice thing about extending the event into a virtual event for a little while. Means that I can look at the sessions that I didn't go to, and I can also say all the things that I didn't have time to say because I got a lot of things to say.
Finally, there was one other thing that's just fallen out of my brain, so I'll pick it up later, maybe say it at the pub. Photographs. You probably noticed that myself and Guy were running around taking photographs of everything. I'm going to put all of those on a Dropbox, and then Simon will email the link to everyone. There'll be photographs of you and things like that if you want them. Please do let me know, daniel.pratt@uwl.ac.uk, if you don't want me to put you into the folder. And also our marketing team, because we do exist in a capitalist structure, said that they'd like to grab a couple of photos as well, if that's possible. So if anyone's not okay with that, please email me and I'll make sure no photos of you are disseminated. Otherwise, I would consider silence as acquiescence. And
very much like put the sign up saying you are being filmed.
Yeah. We did put that sign up, but I mean, thought it'd be nice to ask as well. All right. Shall we? Oh, I'm also walking back up to the other end if anyone's left anything up there or they need anything up there. I know there's a couple of suitcases up in my office. See you at the pub or see you online.